There is no them, there is only us. This statement is part of a graffiti in a neighborhood in Toronto, not too far from where I live. It's a statement of togetherness and division. This statement has been used by famous people, Bono, the lead singer of U2, Bill Clinton. But who are them? And how are they different from us? Are they Aboriginals? Are they French Canadians? Are they American Republicans? Are they people with different skin color? In this talk, I'm going to focus on immigrants. Immigration is an age-old phenomenon. It has been part of human history as far as we know. And what you see in this figure, it shows the current trend of immigration. In 2015, there was almost 250 million international immigrants. This is a sizable population, and it has grown since, for example, 1960s, which was about 100 million immigrants. But when we compare that to the global population, we see that size of immigration hasn't increased in proportion. Roughly 3% of humans move from country of their birth to another country. This is an important point to consider because the vast majority of people do not leave from the country they are born. Nevertheless, it's an important topic to consider because it is facing a number of challenges for countries that immigrants end up going. So the next question is, who are they? Where do they come from? And why they come? This graph shows that immigrants come from all over the world. Every continent is shown as different color. 80% of immigrants come from developing nations. This means they come from Latin America, Africa, many countries in Asia, and some countries in Eastern Europe. Half of those immigrants end up going to developed nations. Again, it means they come to North America, Western Europe, Australia and New Zealand, and a few countries in Asia. Majority of people who come, they are between the age of 20 and 64, with a median age of 39. So they are quite young. Therefore, they end up being part of the labor force market quite extensively. The reason they come varies. It ranges from environmental crisis to war, conflict. People move for love and relationship. But the most important reason that has been listed is for economic prosperity. In the era of anti-immigrant sentiment, it is important to also look at what are the benefits of immigrants in the destination country. One of them is population growth. Considering that most of immigrants, half of the immigrants end up coming to developed nations, and considering that developed nations, they have a declining birth rate, immigrants have been the primary source of population growth. As you see in this graph, since 1990s, immigrant has been the primary source of population growth in developed nation. And starting 2020, they will be the only source of population growth. In 2018, in Canada, 80% of population growth was based on immigration. The other impact is they contribute to economic growth. Immigrants work in a wide range of sectors, from labor to service to highly professional jobs. They also create jobs. They are entrepreneurs. They give taxes. And when we calculate the net effect of immigrants, which means the amount of tax they give to the country of destination and the benefit they get in terms of services, we find that the outcome is positive. So now, The question for many social scientists, including politicians, is that how do we integrate immigrants successfully? Change the narratives that we have about immigrants and immigration. The language we speak shapes our behavior, shapes our thinking. The narratives about immigrants, however, is not very positive. Here are some of the examples that, as you see, these are titles of some of the newspapers, British newspapers, and there are hundreds of examples like this. What you see here is sensationalizing the issues around immigration, demonizing who immigrants are and why they come. This is, of course, problematic because the knowledge for many people about immigrants comes from social media. In my lab, we have looked at national newspapers, the way they represent or talk about immigrants and refugees, and we find that when immigrants are presented as bogus, as criminals, when they are represented as titles like this, the last one, The Flood of Asylum Seekers, a Canadian newspaper, then there is a perception that we need to do something. We need to toughen our policy toward immigrants. This also creates a categorical thinking. Us, non-immigrants, them, immigrants. Again, a well-established principle states that when we start thinking in categorical manner, we tend to exaggerate the differences between categories, and we tend to consider the similarities within the category much more than it exists. This doesn't have to be just about immigrants. It applies when we think about men versus women. It applies when we think about religious group, Muslim versus Jews. And the categorical thinking leads to discrimination and prejudice. It's also important to consider that integration of immigrants is a two-way process. It's a joint responsibility of immigrants themselves and also the destination country. And managing diversity, one of the best known or most effective is multiculturalism. Multiculturalism stands in a sharp contrast with assimilationist policy or melting pot approach. Unfortunately, the discourse around multiculturalism hasn't been always positive. Angela Merkel famously said, multiculturalism has utterly failed. David Cameron said, multiculturalism does not work in Britain, and Britain needs a stronger identity. And more recently, Jeb Bush said, multiculturalism does not work for America because it disunites Americans. This, of course, problematic because none of these countries have ever attempted multiculturalism. Multiculturalism cannot fail if it hasn't been fully realized. What we have here is the distinction between multicultural societies versus multiculturalism. Multicultural societies is a characteristic of every society we know. We don't know any modern society that is not diverse. So every society is multicultural, but not every society practices multiculturalism policy, which is a normative response to multiculturalism, to multicultural society. It has been also suggested that multiculturalism policy is a mighty task because it is about balancing between unity, citizenship, and also diversity, and making sure assimilation is not a requirement for immigrants. As far as we know, no country has achieved multiculturalism fully. But some countries have attempted multiculturalism to some degree, and some of them are more successful than others. This is based on a number of criteria, and that would be like presence of multicultural ministry, When we allow immigrants to have dual citizenship, that's a criteria of multiculturalism index. Presence of multiculturalism curriculum at a school, that's again another characteristic. Based on this, researchers have been able to categorize or rank countries that receive immigrants to a large degree. You recognize these flags. Canada and Australia rank number 1 in terms of being successful relatively on multiculturalism experiment, followed by Sweden, New Zealand, and Belgium. The next question is, what are the impact of multicultural policies? We know that countries that accept or practice multiculturalism, generally people have positive views toward immigrants. This graph, which is based on a survey of 140 nations, shows that countries such as New Zealand, Canada, Australia, Sweden, the 4 of the 5 top countries on multiculturalism policy, people in general have positive attitudes toward immigrants. They think immigrants are good for the country. In addition, we know, again based on 140 countries, immigrants themselves, they score more positively about themselves when they live in countries where they are accepted. Immigrants' adjustment is associated with the degree they are able to integrate in the society. And by integration, I don't mean something vague. I'm sure she'll be back soon. She's somewhere integrating awareness about something. That's not what I mean. There is a specific definition about integration, and that's when immigrants or minority are allowed to keep their heritage culture and at the same time participate in the larger society. We know that when we provide that opportunity, people identify with their destination country. This is a Canadian statistic that shows 78% immigrants, they consider themselves Canadian, versus 12% who still consider themselves as identify with their country of birth. This is also reflected in terms of level of citizenship. Canada and Australia have the highest number of immigrants who become citizens. So if you can go anywhere in the world, where would you go? This question was asked in a recent family gathering, and people were naming exotic places, historic places that they would like to go. In that gathering, my dad, who is an Iranian immigrant, said he would go to Mississauga. And for non-Canadians who don't know where Mississauga is, it is not Canada's hidden destination for beaches. It has a population of 50% immigrants with a strong immigration support community. For my dad, Mississauga is the best place in the world because it is where he's close to his family, and it's also where, when he arrived under the family reunification class, he was welcomed and accepted. So, acceptance and kindness breeds acceptance. Rejection and hostility breeds rejection. Thank you.